Hello, and welcome to Fantasy Writing for Barbarians. I'm John Negroni. I'm a published fantasy author with over 11 years of experience as a professional writer and editor. Today on the show, we're going to take a look at a question and a little bit of a sample prologue from one of our Discord members. That's right, we have a Discord. It's actually part of the larger inbetweendrafts.com Discord, which you can join anytime you like. You can find it in the show notes, of course. We have a channel, a writing channel, and we also have new episodes of the podcast and all that stuff. But this is a space where you can chat about writing. People chat about writing all the time in there. And in particular, we got a question from one of our frequent posters that I want to read today. So here we go. And this is a fun one. And I did a little bit more prep than usual. And by prep, I mean, I gave it some thought and read through it. Usually I read these off the cuff. I don't usually have a lot of prep time. But I did see this question in the writing part of the writing channel of the Discord. So I did have some time to ponder. And I think that's for the best because I want to make sure I'm as accurate as possible. So this question comes to us from Arcana. I think that I'm saying Arcana. I'm just going to say Arcana because I forget how you pronounce that in the Latin sense, I guess. But here is Arcana's question. Okay. Does horror count as fantasy? I always wondered because of one of my books I'm writing has it. Blood Oaks is the title so far. Might have to revise the title. There is some fantasy in it. It takes place in an enchanted forest with a mansion in the middle, just south of the border of Canada. Just don't know exactly where the line is. I'm reading dark fantasy books right now for inspiration. Now, okay, Arcana also included a very short prologue, and I don't know if I'll read the whole thing. I'm going to get through kind of the response, I'm going to respond to what Arcana's question is and all that, and then I'll save a little bit of a reaction to the prologue here. And either way, you'll be able to respond, or you'll be able to follow along with the prologue if you join our Discord, so you can see that in context. But all right, I'm going to take a look at this now. Okay, so to answer your first question, does horror count as fantasy? Yes. And also, no. It depends on the kind of horror, and it also depends on the elements you're actually working with. So I'm going to break this down hopefully as clearly as I can. So to start, horror itself is a genre defined by tone and emotional effect. Okay, I'm going to say that again. Horror is a genre, and it's a genre that's defined by two things, tone and emotional effect. So what that means is it's meant to evoke certain emotions, fear, dread, unease, the uncanny. These are the main kind of horror things that you're supposed to feel when you watch a scary movie, read a scary book. Fantasy, on the other hand, is defined by, a lot of things. If you boil it down, fantasy has two big things that set it apart: setting and world logic. It usually involves magic, mythical creatures, secondary worlds, supernatural systems, barbarians even. And so that said, yes, horror can be fantasy, right? Because these two things, they don't contradict each other. Horror as a genre doesn't exclude what makes fantasy, right? So it can be fantasy horror if it includes the supernatural or the impossible, stuff like that. Horror, though, can also be entirely realist. It can be something like Psycho or The Silence of the Lambs. And then obviously fantasy isn't always scary. Most of the time fantasy is, epic, or, it's trying to be something, it's usually evoking things like wonder and excitement. It can be a thriller, all kinds of things. Fantasy can apply to all kinds of genres. It's actually hard to find a genre that fantasy couldn't, right, have as a subgenre, honestly. But here's where it actually gets a little bit juicy, because Arcana also mentioned dark fantasy, right? And what is the real difference between dark fantasy and horror fantasy? That's something I don't see a ton of conversations about all the time. I'm sure there's a billion Reddit threads about it. But my own take is that, yes, dark fantasy and horror fantasy have a ton of overlap. And I want to preface this by saying, don't overthink this. Don't worry about it too much. I don't think Arcana is. But I would say that if you're kind of engaging with this, maybe you see the thumbnail, on the YouTube or the podcast or whatever, and you're like, is this a horror fantasy? Is it a dark fantasy? Most of the time, this is stuff that's going to be decided by a marketing team. Unless you're self-publishing, this is not something you need to worry about right now, because the two things really, it kind of depends on how you want to present the book, but you can ahead of time have a little bit at least of an understanding going into writing your novel. Okay, is this supposed to be more dark fantasy, more horror fantasy? What's the difference? Let's break that down though. So dark fantasy is when you blend, let me make sure I define this correctly. It's usually when you blend the emotional texture of horror with the world building of fantasy. Actually, I'm going to break this down even more simply. Hopefully this tracks. So if you take fantasy and you take dread and you put those two things together, dark fantasy. Okay, we have a whole episode of dark fantasy about dark fantasy. It's what we have a video version and an audio only version. You can definitely check that out. But with horror fantasy, that's usually when you take horror and magic and you put the two things together. That's not all of horror fantasy, but a lot of it is. So there is a subtle difference between these things based on which genre is in the driver's seat. If fantasy is in the driver's seat, it's dark fantasy. If horror is in the driver's seat, it's horror fantasy. Okay? Now, in Arcana's case, they're talking about enchanted forests, eerie mansions, a lot of horror vibes in this. They're likely mixing both, and that's a strength. You know, if there's a lot of overlap between the horror, dark fantasy, all that stuff, that's not a big issue. Okay. I do want to give some examples because I was thinking about this and was like, what would be like some good books that would help evoke what I'm talking about? There are plenty of famous stories that live in this space. One of them, of course, well, a whole series would be The Witcher. The Witcher is like ultimate dark fantasy, right? Andrzej Sapkowski, I think was the author's name. So it's a high fantasy world, right? If you go into The Witcher, even if you play the games, you're aware of this. But there are a lot of horror-leaning short stories in The Witcher about monsters, curses, moral dread, that kind of stuff. The Broken Empire series is another good example because this is Mark Lawrence's Broken Empire. It's epic fantasy, but it has a lot of graphic violence, nihilism, grim horror elements. Shadow of the Gods by, I think, John Gwynne? Yeah, John Gwynne. I can't believe yes, Shadow of the Gods, also great example of dark fantasy. It's Norse inspired, and you have like these terrifying creatures, right? So when you think of these examples, right, horror is not in the driver's seat. The fantasy is in the driver's seat. That's why it's dark fantasy. Now, here are some examples where it would be horror fantasy because horror is in the driver's seat. Mexican Gothic, great example. Silvia Moreno Garcia's, because it's like a haunted house horror, right? But it's vividly imagined Gothic. It has supernatural twists, but the horror is like the primary focus and marketing of that book. The Fisherman by John Langan is another good example because the cosmic horror, the Lovecraftian stuff, is definitely in the driver's seat here. There is folklore. There are like these strange rituals and like mythic stuff, but it's not the main focus. Another good example, I hate to mention Neil Gaiman considering, the Neil Gaiman of it all. But yes, Ocean at the End of the Lane is a good example of horror fantasy because here the horror is like way more, like the existential horror is way more like at the forefront than like the fantasy stuff. So I would say that that's a good example. And also for Arcana's benefit, if you haven't checked these out already, some kind of like foresty haunted mansion horrors you could look into for a little bit of exploration maybe and emulation, or even if you want to find comparative titles. I think of House of Leaves by Mark C. Danielewski. That's a pretty fun kind of, it's like postmodern horror, but it's definitely like in the fantasy space, like the surreal fantasy space that you might be able to help, comp your book if you want to reach out to agents. I would say The Ritual by Adam Neville is also a good example. It's kind of like these friends hiking through like this ancient Nordic forest. I to be honest, I haven't read the book. I did read part of the book, but I watched the movie. The movie is my introduction to it, but it seems like a similar vibe to what you're describing, although not as, yours seems to have more fantasy in it. This is like pagan horror stuff. So anyway, I would say in terms of like where the line is, because you mentioned that too, I don't think there is a hard line, right? This is a spectrum. And we really need to think of genres more so as tools instead of boxes, right? You don't want to put your book into a box. You just want to use genre as a tool to kind of fix your story, to make it more presentable to people so they understand and can frame, their expectations around what your book is trying to do. So I would say ask yourself these questions if you're like still kind of confused, you're still not too sure. So ask yourself, okay, is the story revolving around the emotional experience of fear, right? If it is, then you're writing horror. That's probably the best way to frame it down. Another question you can ask yourself is, okay, does the story revolve around the existence of magical rules or systems? Because if it is, then you're writing fantasy. You're writing a horror fantasy. And if it's really like a really strong blend of both, if it feels equal, if it feels like it's hard to pin it down, it's most likely dark fantasy, in my opinion. And honestly, again, publishers, booksellers, marketing teams, they're going to categorize your work based on which genre is the strongest hook, right? So you don't necessarily need to worry that much about this sort of thing right now. I'm glad you are thinking about it because that is a good thing. You should be thinking about this stuff, learning about this stuff, and getting better at knowing the industry. That's great. But, what matters most right now is just trying to write the most emotionally compelling, thematically rich version of your story as possible, right? So you really want to make sure your focus is always on that. Sounds like it is. And you did mention your title that you might revise it. I actually think the title Blood Oaks, I think it works pretty well for like a dark fantasy horror novel. My only thought was that the movie Shelby Oaks just came out, the Chris Stuckman movie. So it might be a little bit too similar to that, but it's not a hard and fast rule. You never know. But I do like that it's a bit atmospheric. It's a bit punchy. I like that it's not too long. It suggests violence because of blood, and the Oaks kind of has like a nature myth vibe. So might be appropriate for this kind of story, especially based on the prologue that I kind of peeked at there. And I would say too, like if the enchanted forest you mentioned is the central mystery or the threat, definitely lean into it. Think of the forest as a character, not to be cliche, but what does the forest want, right? What kind of person can survive in this forest? What kind of person wants to carry on the legacy of the forest, that kind of stuff. And yeah, as I said before, try to keep on reading dark fantasy. I think that that's great that you are kind of investigating that. Definitely try out some horror authors who bend the genre in the way that it sounds like you want to. So like T. Kingfisher, I can't say that too quickly, right? T. Kingfisher, like Nettle and Bone, the Twisted Ones, I think is a great author in that space that you can check out if you haven't already. Also, Brian Evenson, who did Song for the Unraveling of the World. Yeah, my memory is failing me today. Would also be a great reference point. So in terms of the actual prologue, I'm not going to read the whole thing. It's not even that long, but I don't want this to be a super long episode. But you can check it out in the Discord. But the general gist is that there's like flames, there's like this big fire, there's this figure in the darkness. It's like a dark, nimble figure. It's unfazed. Somebody made this like, Faustian bargain apparently with this creature, and a bunch of people are dying. There was this promise to save them, and then the figure is like, blood in their teeth. And it's like, I'm not going to save you. It's very, very bleak, right? So, and I think it does give me extra clarity on the tone and direction of the Blood Oak story that you're writing, Arcana. But yeah, here is how I would definitely try to categorize it myself. If you were taking my 2 cents, right? Ultimately, it's up to you. But my opinion, definitely horror. This is horror. This is full stop horror fantasy to me because I think just the existence of the mysterious, like magical bargain or pact and all that, like you promised it would save us. I think that really sells it as, horror really being like, yes, there is fantasy, but the horror emotion of it seems more important than like the rules of it, I guess, to me. That makes sense. I think the supernatural figure, how it comes across, it's like inhuman and cruel. I get the sense that it might be immortal. That feels very, very fantasy to me. The setting hints at this, like, because of the enchanted circus thing, like a big top, right? Which kind of adds almost this, like, sort of surreal fairy tale texture, right? So, yeah, to me, that feels like the fantasy is important, but the emotion, the horror emotion of it all is really, really prominent. You could say that this is dark fantasy too. Like, I think I would have to read a little bit more. But I think right now, based on this, I would say it's pretty much horror fantasy, especially because it's got this like dark fairy tale vibe to me. And it reminds me a little bit of like the Night Circus, but kind of mixed with the Babadook, even like a little bit of Pan's Labyrinth, that kind of thing. I would definitely like a little bit of advice. You didn't ask for it, but I'm going to give it to you anyway. You know me, fantasy writing for barbarians. What are you going to do? Definitely my advice is to keep leaning into the uncanny, right? I think that horror gets misunderstood sometimes. It's not just gore. It's not just fire and extreme violence. It's psychological stuff. The villain doesn't kill Felix outright in this prologue. He lets him believe there was a chance, right? That is twisted. That's very, very horror to me. And I also think you want to make sure you want to keep like building the horror around these things, like the misunderstood bargains, the delusional hope, the metaphysical betrayal. To me, that's a lot scarier than like this big evil mythical creature, who can crush you like a bug or whatever. So I think T. Kingfisher's What Moves the Dead is a good thing to read for just a little bit of an example of that. It's kind of this dark fungal retelling of Edgar Allan Poe's The Fall of the House of Usher, which I really appreciate. It blends a lot of like creeping dread with fantasy rules, and we love fantasy rules at Fantasy Writing for Barbarians. Second piece of advice I'd give is make sure you're setting the world rules through the atmosphere. This is a fun little trick. I always recommend it. I think that it's one of the best ways to do world building in fantasy. So what I'm saying is we don't need exposition about the world yet. I think like the fire, the pillar, the collapsing tent, these are fantasy visuals, right? They're used as horror mechanics. I think that's great. I really like what you're doing with that. So continue to do that. Continue to use sensory detail to imply the larger world. I really appreciate that you didn't just info dump a lot of stuff. Now, it is a prologue. It feels like kind of a cold open to me, but cold open, but it's like fire. But I do think that it's effective in that case because you're trying to set a vibe and a tone. And it sounds to me like you're on the right track there. I think that a good example of this too is Naomi Novik, one of my idols. Uprooted, her book, does this really, really beautifully. She has these early forest scenes that imply this like corrupt magical system way before it's ever explained. And I think that that's such a great example of like trusting the reader. I would also make sure you want to use the villain dialogue sparingly, but also sharply, right? I think there's a nice punchline in here. It's like, I never said I would keep you alive. I like that. You're using language to kind of reframe the horror. That's a really good move. I would say if this character appears again, try to let the dialogue stay like contradictory and clever, even cruel, right? So think of like Crowley from Good Omens, if you were evil, that kind of thing. Give like the villain, a little bit of a tip, 2 cents. But I think it'd be cool if you gave the villain a repeated phrase or like a verbal quirk that can get recontextualized each time we hear it. Something that just makes them even more memorable. Because it was hard for me to totally picture the figure. I think that there's room for you to kind of maybe add a little bit more description. Not a ton, but just enough for me to feel the scene a little bit more to make it even more lush and vivid. And one more thing too, I would say that prologues, we've talked about prologues on the show so many times. So just as a reminder, the best prologues raise questions. And I think in some cases you've done this really well. I think you're already asking, like the reader's also, already asking questions like, who is Felix? What was the deal? What exactly was he hoping to be saved from? Who was the grinning figure? These are great questions to ask. Only thing is that when you ask these questions, make sure that you pay them off well, right? It's a high risk thing when you have so much intrigue and mystery, because then it's like, if you make us wait a long time, especially, the answers might be disappointing because we waited so long, the anticipation kept building. And if you don't have a really good plan for how that's going to get paid off, that could backfire on you. So be careful. I don't want it to backfire on you because the fire and the pun and anyway. But yes, I appreciate how this is definitely a good example of a horror fantasy prologue that opens the door but makes you afraid to walk through it. So well done. So yeah, I just to reiterate, this feels like a horror fantasy, but it has a strong leaning toward like dark bargains, moral horror, surreal, mythic imagery, characters who are desperate and doomed. So like some comps. I'll give you even more comps. I mean, I already mentioned the Night Circus, but seems pretty close to what you're doing. But the Book of Lost Things, you might want to look into. John Connolly, if you haven't. It's like a fairy tale horror, has some coming of age tragedy in it. Shadow Cabinet by Juno Dawson, queer gothic fantasy with a lot of horror, a lot of mysterious bargains in that one. So maybe check that one out too. So yeah, hopefully this was all helpful for you, Arcana. Thank you so much for sharing space with us in the Discord channel. Hey, if you're not in the Discord, what are you doing? Why did you wait until now? You want to read this prologue, don't you? To go check it out if it's still up. They might take it down. But thank you, as always, for listening to Fantasy Writing for Barbarians. Still working on my tech so we can get video back into the mix, hopefully soon. But for now, we're doing the audio-only podcast at the moment. Still on YouTube, so you can check that out, but you won't be able to like look at me, I guess. People like the video. I think it's more engaging, I guess. But hopefully my voice is doing extra work. That's the goal as well. So I'll see you on the next one. Be sure to keep on writing if that's what you feel like doing.